Hello everybody. I'm Ravi. I teach in liberal arts, and this is our podcast initiative for our YouTube channel called Cosmopolis, and we are very glad to have Dr. Théo Le Bret, who is a researcher in astrophysics. He did his PhD in Oxford University, and his doctoral work was largely around the behavior of dark matter in galaxies. And so we are very glad to have you, first of all. And Dr. Théo is actually offering a course on chaos theory and its applications in science and non-science, non-scientific fields this time. And this is a sort of a transdisciplinary course which he's offering to the fellows of our Global Leaders Alliance postgraduate program. And we want to talk more about the course and the really experimental, radical nature of it. And maybe Theo, if you could just begin by talking to us briefly about the motivations behind offering this course.
Okay, so to discuss briefly what I think is the aim of the course I'm teaching at the moment. It's to, I think, introduce a non-specialist audience to the sort of concepts that subtend the field of chaos theory, because I think essentially it's still sort of nearly half a century after its inception as a field. It's still very difficult to access it without mathematics. I think that there's been a very popular book by James Gleick, which dates from the 80s, and I don't really know of any other very popular access route to this theory. And also, I guess I would aim to make this course something more than just a sort of like pop scientific sort of introduction, in that I would wish that by the end of the course the students gain some understanding of the concepts that underpin chaos, but more importantly that they be able to sort of apply them to their own fields, right? So the idea is to be able for the students to gain intuition about this field, which is still reasonably difficult to access, in order that they apply them to a wide variety of their fields.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting themes through which you introduced the students when I was attending your classes was when you talked about the idea of complexity in itself, right? And for me, the most profound distinction that you made was, on one hand, you had self-evidently complex systems with lots of interacting, parts, and lots of variables giving rise to complex behavior. And on the other hand, you had the idea of chaos theory promising this idea that you could have complex behavior arising out of simple systems, or at least systems that could be modeled through reasonably simple mathematical models. So, I mean, if you could just build more on that idea.
I think that's, to my mind, that is the crucial point, right, of chaos theory, is that usually we assume that complex behavior has complex causes, right, it arises from the interaction of many different subparts in a system. And inversely also, we assume that a simple system, a system that is described by very simplistic mathematical models, will only be able to display some very simple and basic predictable behavior. And I think the interesting thing about chaos theory is that it really upsets these two false intuitions that we have about not so much the world even, but about the way our models behave and work. And I think this is something that's sort of to me the main takeaway, I think, of this course is that is to cast a more critical view, I think, of modeling as an intellectual activity, right? To realize that deep complex things can arise from models that you can write down in a line, less than a line, and things that you can illustrate with a pocket calculator actually contain some very deep physics and some very deep insights about what things we can predict, about what counts even as a good prediction, a good model, right? What sorts of things do we expect our models to be able to say, right? Because I think in many ways there's a fundamental break, I think, in sort of like the theory of chaos with the previous sort of Newtonian clockwork idea of physics, right? Where somehow the hope was that if your model was good enough, then you just cranked the crank and out came some perfect predictions of the future, right? And this sort of like clockwork model of the of 18th and 19th century physics is, I think, is very much just lays in tatters, right? Once you become aware of chaos arising, even in the simplest of mechanical or dynamical equations, right?
Yeah. In fact, the most interesting part is what you tend to say is that chaos theory could really give us a revolutionary way of thinking about systems in general, be they could be scientific, they could be rising in society, they could be about political systems. And I was just, one skepticism that has been raised, which I just discovered, rediscovered few minutes before our conversation, was the researcher Herbert Simon. He says that, let's say, if you want to, when we look at data around systems, physical systems, we have a time series data, we have a certain parameters being recorded continuously and observed, and he says that there's very few social behavior or non-scientific behavior which is tracked like that, even economic behavior. So he says even within economic behavior, maybe for stock market data, or maybe it's for something like the exchange rate, you can have a really dense and continuous time series data, because that's something you track moment to moment. But if we don't have data in the first place about behavior that is arising in domains outside science, how do we, they could be chaotic, but how do we, the question is, can we really apply chaos theory there?
So I would argue that, so for rigorous applications of chaos theory, obviously, yes, you do need time series data, I think, and which is why I think amongst all the social sciences, where it's been sort of deployed most effectively and it's in its full force, it has been in economics and finance, so in sciences which already have vast access to data, right, and particularly to time series data, because this is where you will be looking for chaos. And also, I'd like to add that even then, it's not actually obvious, because ultimately, chaos is a feature of mathematical models, right? So basically, when we say a system is chaotic, really what we mean is that the mathematical model we use to describe that system is chaotic. But given that, but in principle, there's often not really, it is in principle often pretty difficult to tell whether a system is chaotic, where it behaves complexly because of simple deterministic rules, or whether it behaves complexly simply because it is filled with random influences, right? And this is a long-standing debate, I think, in the modeling of financial data, with chaos theory, right? As for the social sciences, sort of like more loosely, so I would agree. I don't think you can straightforwardly apply the technique of chaos theory to these fields, and I think it's more of an invitation to sort of apply the broad insights and the concepts, right? To sort of, for instance, I think the concept of emergent behavior, right, of universality, which we find in our models in chaos theory, I think is something that is interesting to anyone who seeks to model anything, right? Because the fundamental insight here is that under certain circumstances, the content of the model, so the dynamics that you've put into the model, are actually not necessarily what's most relevant, right? That there are actually a whole classes of model which end up just producing exactly the same kind of observable behavior, and I think these sort of ideas, right, emergent phenomena, sort of universality, which actually occur in chaos, but also in the study of critical phenomena, right? I think these are concepts which can fertilize, right, thought, just put quite simply, right? I don't think you can use chaos theory to model I don't know, the evolution of marriage rights amongst the Cherokee. But I do think that the concepts that substantiate chaos theory can be usefully applied to pretty much any field. And actually, so because I was reading up on that quite recently. There is a book of chaos and anthropology, right? Where obviously they're not using complex mathematical time series data to study the evolution of human culture or of human institutions, but people, anthropologists like Marilyn Stratton from Cambridge were arguing that basically the basic concepts of chaos could be used to sort of challenge basic ideas that we hold about the way we describe and model the universe, right? And I think this simple idea, that complex system can arise out of very simple models, that's something which really, once you become sufficiently aware of it and sufficiently that this becomes part of the way you think, that's something that can be usefully applied, I think, to anything. And in many ways, actually, I would argue that this is already something that a lot of economists, free market economists in particular, will already be reasoning within those terms, rightly or wrongly, right? But the way they seem to think is that that you can get all the complexity and the multi-layeredness of a human society based on market dynamics where everyone is pursuing the simple maximization of their own profits, right? Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, this is a highly dubious model, right? I don't know that this is necessarily true or even provable, right? But what is the case, however, is that what chaos theory shows us is that actually even such a simple and minimalistic understanding of how human interactions can come into play, that even such a simple model could, in fact, generate behaviors and patterns that are extremely complex and interesting to study. But I think again, there's a very sort of strict distinction, I think, in the study of chaos theory to be made between, are we talking about chaos and complex behavior in our models, or are we talking about it in reality, right? Because these two things are not, it's very often far from trivial to sort of merge these two things together. And actually, this is one of the issues, I think, with chaos theory, is that it's a mathematical field that is also used by physicists, and it was sort of invented by mathematicians and physicists at the same time, and then also some biologists, people who are more interested in population dynamics and things like that. So, but no one quite means the same. When a mathematician says, this system is chaotic, what they mean is that it has some very specific mathematical properties. When a physicist says a system is chaotic, what they mean is that the model they use to describe the system is chaotic, and that they hope that it can generate, for instance, time series data that can be compared and it can favorably be compared with actual data. Yeah. But I think again, it's very the question of what it is that how even you validate a chaotic model, I think, is a very complicated question, right? There are all kinds of new metrics that you need to put in place, because essentially the usual predict and see if the prediction fits doesn't quite work in the same way with chaos theory, I think.
Yeah, and I was just wondering if the way you put it, that at least what chaos theory can do is that it can inspire certain styles of thinking, so to speak, in other disciplines. Like, for example, the idea that complexity could arise out of reasonably simple systems. It's very interesting because whenever we think of a scientific theory, we want to know what we're discussing, what revolutionary change it begins, while at the same time there is a desire to trace its history as far back as possible. And how we begin, and I'm very glad that you gave our students this idea of tracing the roots of chaos theory right from Poincaré, where he's able to see that a mere three-body system can generate such complex dynamics. Yeah. So I mean, shall we say that maybe it's around the 1970s when you have people like Lorentz maybe extending, looking at behavior like weather change, and evidently weather change is, after all, probably million causes combined, but if we can look at certain parameters and find a model a chaotic model using those parameters, then we can maybe explain something about weather. So
Yeah,
I mean
so
that happens pretty late, I would say.
Exactly. So I think so some of the fundamental ideas and intuitions about chaotic models do date from Poincaré. I think there's his work on the three-body problem in particular. He introduces methods, for instance, the Poincaré sections, that will be useful and used in the study of chaos, sort of a century later, nearly. But I think it's true also to say that that as a field, it becomes sort of. It becomes a field in practice, I think, very much in the late 60s, early 70s. I think simply because you can't really practice chaos theory without computers, basically. Because ultimately,
that's interesting, yeah.
Exactly. Ultimately, the reason that it took so long to discover chaos is that we were sort of, the physicists are always looking at systems that they already know how to solve, right? And if you don't know how to solve it, then you're trying to figure out approximate solutions manually is a terrible headache, right? So basically what computers did is that they allowed some kind of theoretical experimentation, right? Something that wasn't quite, a real world data experiment, but which also allowed you to really sort of sweep the whole range of what your model how your model could behave. Because in many ways, one of the most fundamental chaotic systems that was studied, the logistic map, was actually studied way before the 70s, right? People who were studying population dynamics were aware of the existence of this model. They actually used it, but they really only focused on the well-behaved solutions, on the non-chaotic solutions, simply because A, they didn't really have anything to say about the chaotic ones, so they just swept it under the rug, and two, it was very difficult to engage on a systematic exploration of all the parameter space of this simple dynamical map. So yeah, I think we can already trace some of the insights of Poincaré. They would be the ferments, I think, of chaos theory, and certainly he is like one of the foundational figures in the field of dynamical systems. But it really is in the 70s when we start using computers to explore the entire parameter space and to visualize also simply the way our models function. I think one of the interesting things about chaos is that it's full of pictures, right? It's a very different way of approaching scientific data, because ultimately, if we take the example of weather forecasts, right, the great breakthrough of chaos theory is not to give us a better weather forecast or better models. Actually, what it does is it ruins the hope that we can ever get, a perfect weather forecast for a month's time, right? But what it does is it suggests a different way of doing things. It says, well, okay, ultimately, chaos in our models, sensitive dependence on initial conditions, meaning that a small mistake today will be a big mistake in a week's time. This thing is an intrinsic part of the weather forecasting models. It can't be gotten rid of. And given that that's the case, basically, you can no longer hope that by making your model better or finer, you will get a much better prediction in 2 weeks' time. But what you can do now is just use what's known as ensemble weather forecasting. So you have maybe 100 different models, starting with slightly different parameters, slightly different initial conditions, and you just look at what the ensemble does, and that sort of now gives you a broader idea, right, of how your model is behaving. And this is, I think, this is one of the ways in which chaos has changed the way we practice science. I think there are just certain types of data of prediction problems that we don't do in the same way now that we know about chaos. And I think weather forecasting and medium range weather forecasting in particular is a very this is a very important example, I think, of the way that chaos has changed our practice. And I think in many ways there are different fields where our practice has not been changed much, but it sort of should have been, right? Because ultimately, what the study of nonlinear systems tells you is that quite often the way we think about uncertainty only really strictly applies to linear systems, and fairly often by applying the insights of linear systems to the study of uncertainty in nonlinear systems, we're really trying to fit, a square peg in a round hole, right? And this can potentially also bring about very misleading predictions, because your degree of certainty in the predictions might be wholly based on intuitions that were valid for linear models, but which simply do not hold for nonlinear models. And I think that's another thing that I sort of want to bring to students in this course, right? Is the sort of intuitive grasp that actually, when we talk about uncertainty, we tend to talk about it in a way that only strictly applies to linear models, and that most of the useful models that we wish to use to describe real-world systems, they tend to behave in a nonlinear fashion.
Yeah, and because frankly it never occurred to me, and I just want to reiterate what you were saying, because the whole idea that a scientific theory is in some sense brought alive, maybe the rudiments of it, as you say, were there in Poincaré, but there's a way in which the coming of a certain technology enables a certain science to proceed. In this case, the rise in computational power allows the possibility, as you say, of exploring the parameter space to include all kinds of behavior. I thought that's a fascinating idea to explore, because I think that probably gives me hope about the skepticism Herbert Simon expressed about the unavailability of data in the field of social sciences, because there's so much data. There was also some skepticism, where could it be stored, whether we can even store it or whether we can process it, but maybe no longer with the advancement in computational resources. So
yeah, it's quite possible that even recent advances in both computing power and the efficiency of artificial neural networks and just the sheer volume of data that we now have about the world in general, this is already actually driving a new way of making science, right? Which I think with some pros and cons, right? But certainly you don't approach a problem in the same way, I think, when data is so abundant, actually so overabundant that actually in some ways we give up trying to modeling it at all, and just try and figure out patterns using using artificial intelligence, for instance. And so yes, I think it is very much the case that the chaos theory, the way it's practiced, would not have been possible, I think, without computers. Quite simply because computers suggest basically a different way of approaching model construction, right? Because traditionally with pen and paper physics, the way that it works is you look at a physical system, you intuit how its dynamics might be captured by a differential equation, and if it's a differential equation you can solve, then that's good. You've won the game. If it's not a differential equation that you can solve, well, you have two options: either you rubbish it, or you try to turn it into something that's close enough to something that you can solve that you can still say something about it, find approximate solutions, right? Whereas with computers, it's quite different, right? You can come up with any kind of model and just evolve it using the computer's ability to evolve forward a differential equation. Like the computer doesn't need to know a functional solution of the differential equation. It can just evolve the equation anyway. So this suggests a way of doing science that's completely different, right? You come up with your model and you try and look at what the model says, right? You're not even necessarily sometimes starting with the real world, right? Feigenbaum, for instance, when he was studying in Los Alamos, wasn't even really studying physical systems at all. He was just studying, he was running, experiments with a calculator, basically. He just figured out, some iterative experiments to run with some very, very simple models, very simple numerical models, which were just mathematical functions, right? But which didn't really have any, physical content at that point, and the difference between the way he started out working on chaos theory and the way that a 19th century physicist would have gone about it is that he turned this into a kind of almost empirical thing, right? Because it's not data, right? It's still just numbers out of a computer, so it's not real world data. That has to be very clear in one's mind. But it's a way of toying around with the model, of really prodding it and seeing how it reacts. Even in cases when you can't really necessarily solve the model in the rigorous way that physicists understood it in the 19th century. And I think this is something that you'll see used a lot in chaos theory. It's like this idea of gaining intuition, right? So you don't really the way that you understand your model is really through interacting with it, right? It's through exploring its parameter space, through exploring its behavior under a whole range of initial conditions, rather than just having the model, having the solution, and then plugging in the numbers to get the prediction. I think it's just a fundamentally different way of doing science.
Yeah, and I think my last question to you would be sort of relating to the challenge you must be facing in teaching a class with such varied background, and especially students from a non-scientific background, because specifically I can tell you that having studied both literature and the sciences, in the field of literature, for example, chaos theory, not among people who have actually academics who have written on chaos theory in literature, but the way it's received among other people is that in a very impressionistic way. For example, this almost like chaos theory is the sign of our times. It's our zeitgeist. We live in chaotic times, uncertain times, with the COVID outbreak and stuff. So there's some resonance with our zeitgeist, so to speak, because that's one way, and in which the theory is often received. And I wonder what we could say about the fact that after all, a more interesting insight which is lost probably is what you're saying. For anthropology, I can totally relate, because we have this idea that a very simple interaction between individuals can lead to very complex social behavior, So what have been the challenges on that front?
So I think indeed the one pitfall I absolutely wish to avoid is giving this sort of impressionistic feel for the field, right? Because I think too often, because the central insight of chaos is that simple systems can behave in very unpredictable fashions. One of the kind of quick lessons that are drawn from that is that, if a system is chaotic, then there's nothing more to be said about it, and it's just unpredictable. And given that such simple systems can be chaotic, complex systems must be even more chaotic. Therefore, there really isn't much that we can say about anything, right? And we can only hope to sort of describe things in an ad hoc fashion. And I don't think that that's at all what chaos theory is saying, right? And I think that this is, I think the tricky aspect for me is to communicate to the students some of the conceptual tools, basically, that are proper to the field of chaos, right? So, for instance, the use of phase space diagrams, right? The illustration of what we mean by an attractor by looking at how things evolve in this abstract space of the possible states of a system. So these are basically, I don't wish to introduce the mathematical apparatus of the differential equations and things that are required to study this in great mathematical detail. But I do want the students to come out of this with a few tools which are rigorous analytical tools, right? So for instance, yes, the use of visualizations of phase space, concretely the effects of nonlinearity on error and uncertainty prediction, right? The way that, for instance, our simple kind of bell-shaped curve models for uncertainty just break down fully in chaotic models.
And the relationship between the difference between phenomena, data, and the model which we were talking about.
This is also something to me which is really central, and which isn't, to be fair, something that is specific to chaos. I think just chaos illustrates it rather sort of sharply. Is that yes, that there is, and I think, especially in a world where we rely quite a lot on on modeling, and we rely on the opinions of people to tell us what to interpret the models for us, and any scientific gives you what the model says and some uncertainty as to what the predictions of the model are, right? And unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings and confusion around the sort of precise relationship that exists between reality, data, models, right? Because none of these things interact in ways that are trivial, right? A model does not contain all the dynamics of reality. The way you compare, data itself already, assumes that you've asked certain questions of your system. When you give data with observational uncertainty, with error bars, basically, you also assume something about the shape, basically, of the error distribution. So there are all kinds of assumptions that come into these comparisons between model data and reality that are really non-trivial. And I think it's just chaos sharpens the distinctions, because I think if you blur the distinctions with a linear model, you can still get away with it, right? In systems that behave linearly, you won't be too surprised at the end of the day, right? If you don't fully understand the relationship between these things. With chaotic models, you will end up, being seriously misled by your model if you've misunderstood what it is that the model is even capable of telling you, really. And I think this goes back to this question, for instance, the ensemble weather forecasts, right? Where ultimately the real insight of chaos was saying, well, we just need to do things differently. We need to ask different questions of our systems, of our models, and we need to compare the data and the models in a way that is sort of more finely attuned to the specificities of nonlinear systems.
So I think we've come to the end of our conversation. I thank you very much. Certainly I learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers too, because one of the things that a broad vision of our course is to bring science and abstruse mathematics, and talk about the profound implications, which are, I think, potentially enjoyable for every layman, whoever it is. So I thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me.
And so that's the end of our podcast.